During the Second World War, a large number of terrible war crimes were committed by the Japanese army. They would slaughter wherever they went, even before the war had broken out in Europe, and much of the horrors they committed occurred inside of China. There were even 2 soldiers and officers who had a competition to see who could slaughter 100 people the quickest using a sword, and this shocking event was even documented inside of newspapers, almost like a sporting event. But the Japanese also became known for their treatment of prisoners of war, and these men and women who were captured were often subjected to harrowing, torturous ordeals and deportations and forced marches. Inside of prisoner of war camps, the Japanese put the prisoners to work in horrific conditions, but one prison used by them was Changi Prison in Singapore, where at the end of the conflict a number of Japanese brutal torturers were executed inside the execution chamber of the prison. These men were involved in a horrific war crime known as a double tenth incident, and for their involvement they paid the ultimate price. Join us today as we look at the executions of the brutal torturers of Changi Prison, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The double tenth incident took place on the 10th of October 1943 inside of Japanese-occupied Singapore. It involved the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police. They carried out the horrific torture of dozens of people, and a number of these people died inside of Changi Prison because of their treatment. In 1943, a special branch of the Kempeitai, which was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Haruzo Sumida, were asked to find people responsible for carrying out acts of sabotage and resistance inside of Singapore. The Japanese forces had been affected by having some of their stores burned down, and also their communication lines cut, and Sumida believed that those inside of Changi Prison were coordinating the resistance from behind bars, and he ordered the Kempeitai to carry out a raid on the prison. The Kempeitai became notorious for their torture and execution of prisoners, and also violent reprisals during the Second World War, and they were also involved in rounding up women who could be sent as comfort women to serve inside of Japanese military brothels. They just stole these women off the streets at times. They would also find test subjects for the sadistic human experimentation of Unit 731. But they raided Changi Prison, and the main suspect of the raid was a British barrister named Rob Healy Scott, who had been arrested for anti-Japanese propaganda, and he was held in the prison. But Scott and no one inside of Changi was involved in the sabotage, and the raid became known as a double tenth due to the fact it occurred on the 10th day of the 10th month. But Scott had heard about the fact Japanese ships had been blown up in the harbour, and they believed it was Chinese guerrilla fighters who had done this, but the Japanese Lieutenant Colonel Sumida thought the British were behind this. The attack on the harbour was known as Operation Jaywick, and it had been performed by a group of British-Australian commandos who had come from Australia in a Japanese fishing boat to cause chaos. The commando raid took place under the cover of darkness, and they sunk a huge amount of resources too, before heading back to Australia. But the Japanese did not believe that a small commando raid could cause them so much damage. They then turned their attention to Changi Prison. The prison had been a British one that opened in 1937, and it was a much celebrated place of incarceration. But during the Second World War, as Singapore was taken by the Japanese, they forced thousands of prisoners inside of Changi Prison, around 5 times too many people for the amount it was meant to hold. There was also a prisoner of war camp set up nearby, and the guards here were known for being brutal. Hundreds of inmates died in the prison, and the conditions were poor, as was the amount of food given to the inmates. Prisoners could be executed if the work they did do was not up to standard, and regular beatings were also administered. Lots of inmates also died due to disease and overcrowding. However, on the day of the raid, the prisoners were paraded in the open at 9 in the morning, and they were not told why this was happening. The commandant of the prison and a number of Kempeitai members came out, and they closed any means of escape for the inmates. The names of some prisoners were read out and they were arrested, but a search of the whole prison then occurred. Evidence was found in some cells, including a large amount of money, and also information about news broadcasts around the war. Further people were arrested, and there was a reign of terror imposed on the prison. However, those who were suspected would be dragged out for torture and interrogation at the hands of the Kempeitai. They were also starved too, to try and make them confess to sabotage. Those men who were suspected did not know about Operation Jaywick, and the confessions they made were under torture. Elizabeth Choi, a woman along with her husband, were arrested for smuggling money into the prison, and Elizabeth was interrogated and tortured, and she was beaten very badly. The Kempeitai forced her to kneel on angled bars of wood, and she had her clothes removed, and she was then shocked with electricity, and her husband was even forced to watch her torture. During the ordeal, she had lost half her body weight over the course of 9 months. But Bishop John Wilson was imprisoned in a cell next to her, and he was also beaten very badly for 3 days, and he was then released. But one evening Elizabeth Choi saw Rob Scott, who had been badly beaten and had been subjected to water torture. Following the evening's torture, Scott was then told he was sentenced to death, and he was forced to write a letter to his wife to say goodbye. Elizabeth Choi continued to be tortured, as did the other men, but the torture of the double tenth incident continued. The inmates were subjected to being beaten with iron bars and sticks. They were also subjected to water torture, in which they were waterboarded. They were also burned with cigarettes and other things that had been ignited, then pressed onto sensitive areas, and they also experienced electric torture and much more. The guards twisted limbs, broke fingers and other joints and limbs, and even flayed the inmates using bamboo sticks. One prisoner tried to take his own life by jumping over a wall, but he then continued to be tortured after surviving, but then he died from his ordeal. Another prisoner asked to take his own life, and a pistol was given to him to take the shot, but this was then taken away just before he did so. 15 people died due to the torture of the Kempeitai. They died inside the cells of Changi Prison, and the suffering spread to the other inmates, as rations were cut and recreation activities were banned for months. However, at the end of the Second World War, Changi Prison was liberated following the liberation of Singapore, and in September 1945 many Allied prisoners of war left the place where they had suffered. Lots were broken and lost a huge amount of weight, being emaciated. But the British then retook control of the prison. They used it to hold Japanese prisoners of war, and this included members of the Kempeitai, who had been involved in the torture of the double tenth and had been involved in running the prison. There were 8 former members of the Kempeitai who were brought to a war crimes trial. They were all found guilty of their crimes and the killing of prisoners of war by means of torture, and for this these men were sentenced to death. They had been accused and found guilty of the torture of at least 57 inmates, which resulted in the deaths of 15, and amongst those members of the Kempeitai was the commander Sumida, who was also sentenced to death. There were 3 others who were given life imprisonment, and one who received imprisonment of 15 years, with 2 others being given 8 years in prison for their actions. Inside of Changi Prison there was a set of gallows which had been made, and this was fitted with a trapdoor, and a number of Japanese war criminals were executed here. The gallows was found in the inner yard of the prison, and there were specifically 3 gallows used to carry out the death sentences of those who had been condemned in the double tenth trials. The prisoners had been on death row for some time. They would be on here for sometimes months before they would be brought from their prison cells, as they had been told the executioner was waiting for them. Each of the condemned had white caps placed over their heads before they went to the execution scaffold. They could not see anything. They were then led up the scaffold and the platform, and 3 circles had been drawn over the trapdoor to show the executioners where they would be hanged from. In April 1946, the 8 Japanese men were taken to the gallows, and they had their arms secured behind their backs, and as the executioner placed them in the circle mark, the executioner also placed a noose around their necks. After a few final checks, they then released the trapdoor, and the Japanese men involved in the double tenth incident plunged to their deaths, and minutes later they would be confirmed dead and were placed in coffins. The double tenth incident made Changi Prison an even more feared prisoner of war site during the Second World War, and there was a huge amount of problems inside of the prison during the conflict. Overcrowding caused huge disease outbreaks and more horror, but the double tenth was an unnecessary torture ordeal carried out upon people who were not involved in sabotage, and the actions of the Kempeitai led to the deaths of 15, and many paid for their actions with their executions at the end of the war, in the same prison and walls that they inflicted such torture. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.